real conversations, and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Nathan Rome is with you. Today we are going to be talking about workplace culture, particularly in a police service setting, and some of the stressors and methods of coping that come along with that. For that, I have Katherine Hancock on the program. Katherine works for the Edmonton Police Service and oversees the research and innovation section, where she works to promote evidence-based policing practices and positive change within the organization. Katherine launched a research-focused community of practice within the service, which gives sworn and civilian police members an opportunity to collaborate across the service, develop their scientific literacy, and build their capacity to conduct and apply research in their own work. Also, she instructs the undergrad course Sociology of Policing at the University of Alberta and is in the final stages of completing a doctorate in sociology, for which she conducted a qualitative study of the organizational culture of sworn and civilian police members. So welcome, Kat.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I think this will be an awesome conversation. It's going to kind of tie in, as I was saying, offline with another podcast I just recently recorded. So a lot of talk about police culture. Yours has a bit of a unique part where it's talking about civilians in policing too. So I think that'll be a good contrast. And I've said it before on here. I think it's something like for every police officer on the road, there's 6 or 7 people behind the scenes that make them functional. I heard that stat somewhere long ago.
Yeah.
So it'll be good to see kind of the civilian side of what you've found in your studies. But yeah, I think we'll kind of start by talking just a bit about you and how does somebody get into this field of the research and innovation and doing all the studies.
Right, for sure. Thanks. So my pathway to policing was a bit unexpected for myself. I originally came to Alberta to do school. So I was came here to do my sociology PhD. I had finished like a master's in undergrad in criminology. So always was interested in crime, but more from like what like really stereotypically like thought serial killers were kind of fascinating and then wanted to learn more about crime and theories and things like this. Originally was like researching other topics, not actually policing, but then wanted to get a bit of a sense of what the real world kind of looked like and some of these institutions that I was studying were. And so my initial kind of like biases and assumptions about policing, like I'll admit were a bit more critical and a bit negative. When I came to work in policing, what I quickly kind of started to realize was that it was a lot more complicated than I had kind of understood it to be. That there was a lot more like different types of roles and specialties and expertise and all of these types of things with the people I worked with. And there was a lot of similarities between kind of like the institutional and organizational constraints within policing as I saw in academia and other types of places that I worked for that I thought was kind of interesting, right? And so I worked as a crime analyst initially. So I worked with patrol divisions, and then I worked in some specialized areas and helped investigators and worked alongside them, which I thought was really kind of fun and cool. And that was kind of my first exposure to, I would say, culture, because something I noticed and people would say to me was like, oh, like civilians can sometimes be like difficult to work with or like kind of different because they can be just different than cops. And I didn't quite know what that meant. I knew how I was and like had to kind of figure things out, but I didn't know what that meant. And then I started to notice it as well of like, oh, there's like a different like senses of humor or like way people joke and things like that. So I started to kind of just observe it as a person in that environment. And then kind of switched roles in EPS and then eventually was able to come back to kind of the research space, which I think really kind of marries my previous experiences with being a student and in grad school and then being able to apply some of that in my workplace. Yeah, but so it wasn't originally where I thought I would land, but have really, really enjoyed my experience and find it like constantly just kind of making me think about people and dynamics and how people engage and like police culture and all of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different personalities you deal with in there, but
Mhm.
also, well, so I know you originally from downtown division when I was working in
Mhm.
patrol and you were working in there, and but I'm kind of curious about you're saying you used to have like a kind of a critical view of police or a negative view. Why is that? And can you kind of describe like where did that develop from?
Yeah, and so I guess, like, it was interesting because I was kind of, it was kind of, like, two-sided, right? So, like, I a lot of, so, like, for in my undergrad, when I would learn about, policing and when I would consume kind of media about policing as, like, a person who didn't have, close ties to the institution and never really got like, I was, like, stopped by police for speeding, like, those kinds of things, but otherwise really limited. A lot of the stuff that you would see, would kind of emphasize negative stories about the police, right?
Yeah.
Like uses of force, violence, and things that are not necessarily untrue, but just that's all you would see. And it would, again, like as a person who is trying to be a critical thinker and is trying to be a sociologist and all these kinds of things, like sometimes, like that's your only kind of access to that is through, kind of third hand things. And a lot of like there's limited police research that really engages with policing very closely. Like there's more and more scholars who have access to police institutions and can kind of do research and kind of get a better understanding of what it actually looks like.
Is that kind of on the police in a way? Like we're too closed. We don't share enough. We don't show people,
Yeah,
hey, this is what we actually do. This is what we go through. So this is why the use of force happens or whatever it might be.
I think so. I think that contributes to it, and then it kind of perpetuates, right? Because then you feel misunderstood and more likely to be closed off and defensive, and then
Yes.
it just starts to kind of become that cycle. Because in my experience, like so at the EPS, for example, we work with a lot of different researchers and try to like provide access and facilitate relationships and things like that. And typically, what we receive back is they're like, "Oh my god, I didn't realize." How hard the job is, or when they go on ride-alongs, what that experience is like, and all of those kinds of things that you just most people don't know how to access it, right? And
Hmm.
so you come to other assumptions and you understand things from how other police services may do things, or what may have been done kind of previously, or not understand like why certain decisions are made in the moment, or
Yes.
like assumptions about like, well, you're trained, therefore you should know how to make this complicated decision in half a second and have every like outcome analyzed and assessed. And like, why wouldn't you shoot him in the leg instead of like all these types of things that you just think are possible when you don't know?
Yeah. I think,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's almost like the expectations that are put on police are not human. Like, you
Yeah.
expect people to almost not be humans anymore, not make mistakes. We're all out there and
Mhm.
we're all Steven Seagal and we're just disarming everybody or whatever it might be.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's is a very good way to put it. Do you think that, where could police make, like, the biggest impact when we're talking about changing some of those views? I kinda have my ideas, and I'll maybe
Mhm.
go into them a little bit after, but I'm wondering, where do you think policing can have that biggest impact on changing the perception of members and what they do?
Yeah. So I think a few things like, and I don't like obviously my experience with policing is and my knowledge of policing is most tied to the organization I have most access to, right? And the place that I work and all of this. One thing that I've found that works, and even from my experience instructing like an undergrad course on policing, is again like having more meaningful interactions with the public. And so in the class that I instruct, we have a lot of guests from policing who come to speak to students about different topics, not as necessarily like lecturers or experts, but just from their experience on different topics that we cover in the class.
Okay.
And something that like the students often will comment on is like, oh my God, like I didn't realize so many of them have like all these like advanced degrees. Like there's so many who have like education. They always assume that that's not a common thing in policing, for example, right? Which is interesting because then they also think that training should make you like superhuman, but they
Yeah.
also then have these low expectations of other things. So it's like it's kind of this like on one hand they want you to be so exceptional, and on the other hand they have these negative assumption.
They think less of you. Yeah.
Yeah, but yet you should be a superhero. So, so from those interactions, like the students will often give these like really, even students who start very kind of closed off to it will express that, they'll get these perspectives that they didn't have before, right? Because then they start to kind of engage with police in a way where it's not a transactional interaction. Like it's actually learning about the person's experience, hearing about like how they think through these things, what their kind of challenges are, the complexities of the role, the pressures they have from other places, all of that kind of stuff. That it doesn't mean that they're going to be like, suddenly like wearing blue lion hats and all of this kind of stuff. Like that's not the outcome, but they just understand it more and they can be critical, but from a place where it's not just closed off. Like it's actually more informed now. And so I think doing things like that are helpful. And then also just making sure that we are doing a good job and being accountable in all of those pieces, right? And then just allowing people to see that work. So it's genuine.
I found one of the best things
Mhm.
in my experience is having people either come out on ride-alongs
Mhm.
or like you're kind of saying, getting that face-to-face interaction, but it's more than just transactional. It's more than just, hey, I'm stopping you for whatever, and I'm just I'm
Mhm.
just trying to get to an end goal here in the next minute. But it's having those conversations and the back and forth.
Mhm.
Do you find a lot of the students in these courses, do they come in, how would I put it? Like, maybe they're coming in looking for, let's say, confirmation bias, to use terms I don't like using, but are they coming in like thinking mostly that they don't like police and this course is going to kind of solidify more in my mind? Or do you find they're coming in because they actually are looking to learn about something and ask questions? Kind of they're open
Mhm.
to either side.
So I think it's all of the things. One of the first assignments we did this semester was for students to do like a quick reflection on like what is their assumptions about policing and where do they get their information about policing. So it's like it's not really meant to be academic. It's really just to give a baseline of what are you interested in about this topic and where do you learn about it and what are you thinking about it. And what from reviewing all of that. So the class usually is about 60, I think, is the capacity. It's really kind of a bell curve, right? So you'll have a few students who are um, really knowledgeable about kind of like policing critiques and very passionate about that. And so you have some of those folks. You have some people who want to be police or maybe in the process. We have those too. And then you have a lot in the middle who are like, all the shows are different now, but like are the kind of people who like would watch CSI, but like
Yeah.
don't really
Okay.
know stuff. Or like there's a lot who most of them express that they learn about policing, like either through previous courses or there's like an Instagram account that all of them talked about.
Oh, that could be terrible. Yeah, don't go to social media.
Yeah. So like it's really like it's pretty scant. Yeah. But so and then some of them would be like, and then sometimes I'll hear my parents watching the news. And so I'm like, oh, okay. That's
You know
great.
what? I find a lot of that, yeah, it just misses the context, right? So it is nice that,
Mhm.
we have these courses now that people can interact with police in. Well, maybe on that, so we'll talk about police culture. We'll kind of move to the bigger,
Mhm.
broader stuff. Can you kind of define culture for listeners? So just what it is and how do you measure something like culture, whether it's qualitative or quantitative?
Yeah. So it's a lot of people from like an academic or researcher lens, they'll talk about culture in different ways. So, for example, particularly with police culture, a lot of early research was really trying to find or like what are the common traits that police have and just what are like lists of values that they talk about. So they might say things like, oh, the police are very masculine or the police are very action oriented or they like risk or and so it's really so again initially it was kind of more just finding out like what are things that are common within a group of people. So that's a really basic way of kind of talking about culture. um Other aspects of it that have been kind of layered on are like well what are shared meanings that are in symbols and things like this that members of a group would mutually understand and kind of recognize, right? Similar as goals or things that they would aspire for or things like this. The way that I look at it in my research and some others have looked at it as well is looking at culture as like tools and resources that people in a group can access and use that make sense within that group. So for example, in my experience, like let's say as a civilian employee in policing, something I noticed that I could use was humor. And so like if I wanted to disagree with the person in authority, I could say, well, that's wrong because this research says this, or I could make a joke about something. And then that tends to be received better because like dark humor, gallows humor, whatever is kind of welcome in policing. And so it's a tool that I can kind of use to get an outcome that kind of makes sense. And so there's different ways to kind of see it, but it's essentially like all the intangible stuff. And sometimes there are kind of like symbols and things like this that we can show externally that are meaningful to a group of people, right? That see themselves as kind of a collective. So like it could be, the way that we see as acceptable styles of dressing or talking, the language you use, all of those types of things can be aspects of it too. But so yeah, so it's approached kind of pretty broadly in different ways by different researchers. But the way I tend to look at it and use it is from that kind of school of thinking that uses it as like an actual useful thing as opposed to more like values.
Yeah. I think maybe people also, when you talk about culture, it just seems like kind of like this thing that floats out in space. So people go, how
Right.
do I talk about it? Or how do I, well, if we want to measure it, how would you measure something like that? So
Right.
when you're talking about your studies, I guess you kind of bring up some of the things like you can get humor, you can look at the language used or the symbols that are used. So,
Mhm.
but there's also a lot of subcultures, and I think people don't realize this. And if you look in the news, a lot of it is just like police are bad or police have the the
Mhm.
the blue wall of silence. It's like maybe that exists in like a certain unit, something, but it's not policing in
Mhm.
totality. It's not the whole thing. But I think that the whole idea of subcultures kind of gets lost in the discussion, especially when people just want like a very nice headline and something that's
Mhm.
quick. But what do you kind of see for subcultures? Like, can you talk a bit about maybe how that's broken down? I like for myself, I see it, you can have subcultures in each division, in each unit. You can have cultures in just a squad. Like it's so there's probably
Actually,
thousands within the EPS alone, but every police service.
yeah. So like it's interesting. So part of that, I don't want to like get too heady, but like or like nerdy about it.
You got the time, so go ahead.
Yeah. So like there's a theorist who talks about how you create these kind of what they call fields, right? And fields are spaces like theoretically, like kind of abstractly, where different types of actors engage and kind of compete for resources and kind of have like dynamics between them, right? And so the actual defining of the field itself, so like who is part of the police,
Yeah.
that in and of itself is not should not be taken as a given, is what this researcher would say. He doesn't look at police specifically, but just in general, right? So like it's kind of a lot of times there's this tendency to use existing um like existing structures like an occupation or a business or like a country or national boundary as something that's like an actual group, but that tends to not be it, right? Because again, like from an outsider you might say, oh, like the similarities between police are enough that is a clear group, but when you go inside you start to see all these rifts where it actually doesn't make sense because like the practices, let's say, of like are like a help unit might be really different of what their norms are and stuff like this from, let's say, a tactical section, right? Where they wouldn't even see each other as
Yeah.
in competition or even like at stake to one another, just because the work and nature of it is so different.
If people want to explain it, especially if they want to critique it, it's very
Mhm.
easy. It's a simplification to just say it's the police, right? Because they
Right.
don't want to get into the nuance of the discussion of the back and forth. So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where it comes from.
Yeah. And like you have these like, again, like when you talk about a police institution, like, so like the EPS, for example, is like what, like almost 3,000 people. Like, so are we saying that does that include civilians when you talk about police culture? Does that include, you know, people who are involved in like HR? Does that include like it's just like so there's so many buckets of people that may not even interact or even necessarily share trait, without actually observing and kind of studying it, right? And so I think, to your point, I think there are a lot of assumptions that there's more similarity than there may be. And it might be the case that it is, and that's appropriate, but it's just without studying it and observing it, it's how can you claim that?
Yeah. Do you find like a lot of the studies that you're doing now and the research and where you
Mhm.
work, is this just why now? Like, why is this stuff coming to the front now, and why are people looking at it? Is it just because of a couple big events that have happened, like George Floyd or BLM stuff, or has this been going on for a long, long time and it's just never been? I don't know. People just haven't taken interest in it until now.
I think it's probably more the latter. I mean, I think it's probably more the latter, but obviously when you have these kind of catalyzing or dramatic events, it stokes interest. But that said, police culture studies, I think they started in the 50s or 60s. Originally, it was researchers would go on ride-alongs basically and just observe members in their work. And so as a nature of the people that they were able to observe, right, it's easier to do a ride-along than it is to and more interesting to do a ride-along than it is to sit in an office with leadership, right? So most of those studies focused on the front line. And so as a result, police culture originally really talked about frontline police culture because they just didn't have access to other parts of the organization. More recent stuff, people, especially because you have sometimes now some researchers who actually work in policing, and so they might highlight other aspects of policing that were overlooked before, like let's say 911 dispatchers or crime analysts or things like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of that early work, which is what most people kind of understand, most people who aren't studying this topic kind of refer to, is really studies about frontline police and patrol officers, right? And patrol officers on the street, right? So, or in the canteen. So it's really kind of narrow, a lot of the research, which I think probably contributes to why people think it's all just one.
Yeah. Yeah. They're only kind of getting one aspect of the whole picture.
Mhm.
Okay. So tell us a bit about your studies. And I'll say, I saw you present some of this stuff at an event that we were at the same time. But I think it's super important work. And as I echoed it when I was in the room speaking. So yeah, just tell some people about your work and what you're seeing within police culture. And if you can kind of differentiate between the civilian and sworn member side, because I think that's a really neat aspect. And obviously, a lot of people don't talk about that. So whether it's the 911 dispatchers or whoever else is a part of this kind of stuff. So what are
Mhm.
you seeing out there?
Yeah, thank you. So I did it's a qualitative study. So primarily I use what are semi-structured interviews. So kind of almost like this, right? Kind of long form conversations with civilian and sworn members in policing. So one of the things kind of following from this conversation that I wanted to do in my study was not just focus on sworn members, because so much of the research does that. Something that I've encountered as an employee in a police organization is that there are more and more civilians, and oftentimes civilians performing roles that are fairly entwined with what police are doing.
Yes.
So, for example, we have a lot of investigative teams, or their analysts will go out with them to do takedowns and interviews and things like that, right? And so, I wanted to see more of that because I just didn't see that in the research. Typically, they're kind of handled separately, and civilian research really lacking overall. So that was my kind of intention. What I found as just kind of broad strokes stuff is that members really would talk about what they call, or what is called, organizational stressors. So in your work, right, stuff can be stressful because of the nature of the job. So occupational stuff. So you know, um, having shift work, the risk of violence in the street, those types of things. And then there's stuff that's from the organization, that also can come into play. It was interesting to me because I think I had assumed that members would bring up stuff like George Floyd, like you mentioned, COVID, all those types of things as really kind of what was at the forefront of their minds. That wasn't what I found. People tended to talk more about stuff in the organization that they were experiencing. So things like sense of fairness at work,
Okay.
organizational justice and procedural justice as it relates to leadership or administrators, decision making, things like this, promotions, all of that. that tended to be what people talked about and kind of occupied their thinking a lot, which was interesting to me, right? Because like there were these really big events that had happened around just right before I had done my interviews. Like I think I did my interviews in 2022. So kind of COVID was still around, but kind of like in its
On its way out. Yeah.
waning phase. Yeah. But like still a lot of like decision making had been informed by it, as well as with George Floyd and defund. There was still a lot of media talk and stuff like this. But folks were more interested in how the organization responded to that as opposed to those things themselves. So that was kind of like a major finding that I had. The other piece that you had asked about with the civilians is it was interesting because like one of the things that stood out to me was a lot of the civilians, they would talk so fondly about their like sworn colleagues. Like they would be like, no, I feel like I really like being part of the team. Like I really feel like part of policing. I really like to, like that's what they really kind of valued in terms of working in an organization like policing. But when I would talk to sworn members, a lot of sworn members didn't even think of civilians. Like I would ask them about, how are relationships with colleagues, and they would say, oh, like my squad is great, or this or this or this, and then or whatever. And then when I would ask about, what about with civilian colleagues? Are there any differences with civilians? And they'd be like, I don't really work with civilians, which was interesting because I'm like, I actually know you do,
Yes.
but because like the nature of their role, but it just wasn't at the forefront because of the nature of their job, right? And so it was a bit of this kind of interesting split where certain, like depending on people's roles, if they didn't have a civilian embedded in their area, they didn't think of that as part of their kind of network a lot of times, right?
Well, I want to ask on that one though, like, why do you think that is? So if
Yeah.
you're a sworn member and, you're doing all these things and it's like you only really, I guess it's like you almost just kind of, you keep narrowing your field till you just get to like the squad, just the group, the unit, and you're just like, 4 or 5 or 10 of you, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And that's like your little group. But kind of as you change the job or you go out from that, it's like it can widen out where you have civilians and civilians identity. It's like a one-way street, I guess, kind of.
It kind of was. And like I think it's interesting because like when you join a police organization as a civilian, right? I think especially if you're working in a role where you're going to be kind of interacting with sworn members. So like versus like let's say if you're working like where I work now, most of us in this building are civilians, right? So like you really could kind of get around with not even clocking where you work. But if you work like let's say as a crime analyst, right? You One of the first things you have to do is start to kind of fit in. And so you have this kind of like active expectation that in order to be received at your job and for people to take your recommendations and to kind of include you, you have to be kind of a conscious actor to try to fit in with that group.
Yeah.
I think so. Like, so it's always kind of at the forefront of or at least it was for me and participants I spoke with. Like they would talk about that process of like trying to understand sworn members, trying to like figure out how to help them and all of that.
You know what I'm thinking is maybe the reason is because when you just talk about policing in general, and if people are
Mhm.
trying to get into law enforcement or something of that nature, the job itself kind of says it like it's the people at the forefront. So you're the police officer. So everybody's kind of looking at like this
Right.
person on the front line
Yeah.
and what do we got to do to support them or help them or
Mhm.
get them wherever they need to go. Maybe that's why it's like that is the most acutely defined position out of
Right.
everything in this job is the patrol officer or somebody who's like really on the front line. So maybe that's why people look that way.
I think, well, and you also all get common training, right? So, like
Mm.
the hiring practices, the training experiences, like the first few years of your job are all not obviously identical because you have different calls and things like that, but you have that kind of baseline. Civilians can kind of come from anywhere. And then, like, a lot of your training sometimes is very kind of randomized. And so you're right, like, it's not as defined and kind of like clear, like, there's a default almost in
Hmm.
the place. What I did find though was kind of structurally in the organization, certain areas where they would, for example, where they would have teams where civilians would work embedded in the area, those folks and their team, the sworn team members, would speak about them as part of the team and would recognize them as an integral part. And so there wasn't a lot of, I should take a step back. A lot of the existing research on civilians and policing tends to really talk about all of these kind of like negative or like even hostile interactions between the two, where like police will be
Okay.
the assumption that police will be mistrusting or not, or feel like they're taking opportunities or those like antagonisms. I didn't see that in my research. What I did find was more, again, a lot of sworn members would talk about like, oh no, civilians bring a lot of skills. They're kind of, may have like different education, whatever. They would overlook them, or they would talk about how like they're really skilled, but you have to be kind of careful with them because they're just different in certain ways. Like they're just not as social, or like
Okay.
they don't get our humor all the time. Like it's just like stuff like that. But it
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily hostile,
Yeah. I could see the
right?
humor side of
Mhm.
it. Okay. I think that's really good kind of like summary of what you're seeing there.
Mhm.
When you talk about the civilian side, because I want to focus a little bit more on them,
Mhm.
are you seeing any kind of, oh, and you talked about the stressors, the organizational stressors. What are they saying that are their stressors? And are those matching up then to what a lot of the police officers are seeing? When we talk about the organizational side, is it pretty much the same, or they have something totally different?
So there was similar stuff. So like for instance, both civilians and sworn folks that I spoke with would express challenges with feeling like transparency with decision making in the organization or communication with leadership or things like that. Both of them would have those issues. It would be in different contexts, right? Because like sworn members might express frustrations around, like, let's say, decision making with regards to like PSB processes or something, or like, like disciplinary processes or something like that. Whereas the civilians would say more around like reorganizations or things like that, just because of what their jobs are. But it would be a similar kind of issue, right?
Okay.
Ultimately,
Yeah.
it's that they didn't feel that processes were just or fair or transparent, or that they weren't included in those types of things. There were some like specific things to civilians flights that they talked about. So again, as I mentioned, like some folks felt like they were like overlooked or not kind of seen as equally like in meetings or things like that, like when they were with sworn peers. Some of them would have that, or like just like having to learn how to engage. That was something that people talked about. Interestingly, it was more often raised by sworn members, where they would kind of sympathize with civilians, that they were saying how like, we would tend to overlook the civilians. Like they would bring it up more as opposed to the
Hmm.
civilians themselves, which was kind of interesting to me. But yeah, so there was a lot of similarities when it came to stuff about the organization. Obviously, some sworn members would also talk about things like the challenges of like shift work, or like the challenges of, yeah, being like the actual risks of the job outside. Civilians also, though, were really like, so both groups really talked about like being misrepresented in the media. Civilians really like were sympathetic to their sworn peers, or also felt that it was something that made them kind of question their roles or their involvement and kind of like that. So like they experienced it similarly
Okay.
from the way they described it, which was interesting because again, like you don't hear that in the news, right? Like they don't criticize like,
Yeah.
oh, the crime analysts are doing a thing, but like, or the research person or whatever. But that was also something that civilians were talking about. Like it seemed like they really like almost had like vicarious trauma for their sworn colleagues.
Wow. Yeah, that's something that 100% I've never heard somebody mention that. So that's a totally new thing to even
Yeah.
kind of think about or consider, right?
Mhm.
Do you think that, well, maybe I'll say I think there's a lot of similarities when you talk about the stressors within the organization, right? So everybody can
Mhm.
be passed up for whatever it is, promotion, job applications, or courses, a
Mhm.
lot of different things.
Mhm.
But I guess, do the civilians have any other stressors that are kind of unique just to them? Or is it pretty much there's going to be a lot of overlap? But was there anything that really stood out, like one or two things that are just unique to the civilian world?
So I think one thing is that people talked about. So you talked about, so like everyone could be passed a promotion, all those kinds of things. an interesting thing among civilians in police organizations is that there tends to be a lot less opportunity for mobility.
Okay.
So because civilians will often report to a sworn member, right? So like as a result of that, you're kind of leveled off at a certain level. And so that was something that civilians brought up, was just that essentially the job you apply for, like on day one, might be the job that you are at when you leave the organization at the end of your career, kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. There's some people who don't need to move up, but well, for me, it's like, wow, I need to, I can't do the same unit for 5 years and then
Yeah.
just stay there. Like, okay, this is the next 20 years of my career.
Mhm.
That'd be,
Yeah. And that was something that was just like a thing for some people, because they're like, well, there isn't a promotion from this area. And so I'd have to
mm,
completely change my job or completely leave the organization. So that was something that I think is unique on that front. It's interesting though, because they would talk, some of the folks I spoke with that were civilians, like they would talk about their aspirations differently. So like when I spoke to sworn members, oftentimes they would say, oh, well, in a few years, I want to go for promotion. I want to become a white shirt. I want to do this, whatever, kind of more standard things like that. When I spoke to some civilians, what their aspirations weren't necessarily like promotional. It was more to become experts in the thing they were doing. And so they were just like, I want to be recognized as like the, making this particular example up, like, but I want to be an expert in like robberies, or I want to be an expert in
yeah.
like, I want to be like a really excellent dispatcher, or I want to be a really excellent when I deal with victims of crime. Like they just wanted to gain that kind of like recognition and expertise. And I think it's partly because maybe it's like with the subconscious knowledge that like other kind of like movements are unlikely. So then
Okay.
it becomes a different form of success or a different form of gratification in your role, which I thought was kind of interesting, because again, like that didn't come up as much when I was speaking with sworn members. They would just talk about more like, oh, I want to go to tactical, or I want to do canine, or I want to get promoted, or I want to do this.
Mm,
But yeah, as opposed to like becoming like, no, I want to be at the best
expert.
at the thing I do right now. Mhm.
I think people just get, they see all the shiny stuff. They just want to go do all these different cool things.
Yeah, for
Do you
sure.
find when we're talking about stressors, when we talk about
Mhm.
change in the organization, does change ever come up as one of the major ones? And
Oh yeah.
I'll probably go down a bit of a rabbit hole, but can you talk about that for a second? Just what
Mhm.
you saw around that?
Yeah. So like, and I'm sure you've heard like change fatigue and all of that. So it came up a lot, like just like kind of the constant change, and whether that's, not knowing, like changing processes and expectations, but then also just having like the structure of units change, having to change your workplace, like just so many aspects of change at work that people were really tired of and kind of burnt out from. It was interesting too, because of that, because they always anticipated that change was inevitable. A lot of participants would kind of just have less likelihood of like buying in or kind of believing the
Yes.
benefit of like other types of changes, because they were like,
Okay.
well, it's
I'm glad you mentioned
yeah,
that because
okay.
I've never done a study, but I've noticed that. And I have said
Yeah.
that to so many people
Mhm.
just throughout different services and many of the conversations I've had on here. And it's just
Mhm.
like, how can you, if you're expecting things to change tomorrow, then
Mhm.
you're not gonna put your full effort in today, right? Like it's just you don't
Yeah.
do that buy-in side. The other thing I find with when we talk about change is
Mhm.
I think police, or I believe police, are fine with change. It's just not the change that either isn't, it's got to have a purpose and a bit of a direction to it. You can't just
Mhm.
change, you just landed in a branch and you're like, hey,
Mhm.
I just got here, but I'm going to tell you how things work. That never goes over well, right?
Yeah.
So when people come in or you just get change from the top or whatever it might be, they have to kind of explain why this is happening and
Mhm.
maybe get some input too from the people that have
Mhm.
been there, but also kind of what's your goal, what's your vision, and how are we getting there. So I've never been a big fan of when people say like, oh, cops just don't like change, or that's just the way it is. Like I hate all those
Yeah.
sayings. I think it's super lazy when people do that.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, change, it's inevitable, and I think people
Mhm.
accept that. It's just if it's implemented correctly and People are given, some idea of why we're doing it, where we're going, and even the
Mhm.
input is allowed, some feedback.
No, I 100% agree with you. I think that perception that like, oh, cops are resistant to change is because oftentimes what the outcome looks like is that changes aren't successful, right? But I don't think it's because individuals necessarily didn't want it. I think it's because, for all the reasons you mentioned, that people don't have sufficient engagement, that sometimes the pace of change and policing is very dynamic work, right? And public safety and all those types of related issues. So I get why we have to kind of make decisions quickly sometimes. But it is hard when, as a person whose job will actually likely be the thing that's impacted, right?
Yep.
Have to be like, oh, again. So now I have to change my hours again, or now I have to have different people that I work with, and all these kinds of things that, if you think about it from like I think about I have friends who are like teachers, for example, right? And like when they have to change the classroom, like the physical room they're in, it's like such a disruption to their day. And that's once a year, right? Let alone like in policing where I'm like, oh, there's been so many times where like in a week they'll be like, oh, now you're working nights, or there's playoffs, therefore this, for like all these types of changes that you just have to adapt to, let alone these bigger organizational ones where like, oh, your unit has a new name now. And now you report to a different bot. And like all of those things that it's again, like I think it takes away from when we actually have things that are meaningful changes that we really want people to buy in, that they would probably benefit from, that would be better, da da da. It just makes it hard for people to stay excited about it because you're just doing it so often.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like I don't know, from in my experience and from people I've chatted with and worked with, like I always get the sense that the police that I've encountered, there are some who are kind of set in their ways and whatever, and whatever, that's a thing. But for the most part, I find people want to do a good job, and if there's better ways to do something, they're open to it. But they
Okay.
want it to be better, is what I get, right? And it's just again kind of understanding why and knowing that if we put all this effort, will it be for something that won't be kind of like thrown out in 6 months?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've seen that, right? Like these are real examples, and you can see this all across the policing world. A lot of these changes are just implemented. It's like knee jerk reactions to a lot of the stuff going on out there, or a politician all of a sudden has a bad
Mhm.
day and says something, and then it's like, oh, all of a sudden the police are making a change because of it.
Right.
So yeah, people don't like those things. Um,
Yeah.
I want to ask about a bit about the coping side of it. So
Mm.
outside of the usual talk about like people drinking or having some sort of vices,
Yeah.
what other coping strategies are we seeing out there? How are people handling this stuff? And are we
Yeah.
getting better at it, or are we getting worse? Where are we at?
So I can't speak to necessarily the better or worse, like from my own research, but what I did see was that there was a bunch of different ways that people coped with the stressors. So like sometimes so some folks would withdraw from what was causing them stress, right? So some people would express things like, you know what, like originally I thought I wanted to advance in this organization. I am staying at my rank. I don't want to become involved in that stuff because it's too political. It's too blah, 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 blah. And so they kind of stepped back, right? This also included people who were like considering early retirement or resigning, things like this. So withdrawing was something that came up. Um, Another piece was some people, especially depending on their cultural resources and access to other people and knowledge about the organization, some people actually would try to address the issue that they have and kind of be more active towards it. So they would say things like, well, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this recommendation to my chain of command. And even if it's refused, I'm going to keep submitting these types of things so things can get better. And like they would cope by really kind of being engaged and trying to make change. Um, Other folks, again, like they would just become very kind of concerned about um, like covering, like CYA, like cover your ass. Like they would do those types of techniques where they would say things like, I am documenting everything, like every directive that I get, I document it and I want it in an email because I don't trust that I'm not going to be thrown under the bus for this.
Yeah.
So they would use that, right? And even civilians would say this, where they're like, my boss always forgets like is just forgetful. Therefore, I always have email records. And so both sworn and civilians would use this.
Well, I would say like a lot on that CYA piece and the
Mhm.
documentation stuff. I mean, that's coming right back to the organizational stressors, right? So
Right.
you have a
Mhm.
lot of that stuff on the inside, and you're either worried that someone's going to do something to you, or you don't
Mhm.
trust somebody that's peer
Yeah.
group or in your chain of command, whatever it might be. So,
Mhm.
one thing I do just
Totally.
want to jump back to real quick is when you're talking about the withdrawal part of it.
Mhm.
I think a thing that could even be added into that, and maybe like if this is something you already consider, let me know. But the depolicing side of stuff, so the whole
Yeah.
FIDO,
Mhm.
depolice, like we saw this everywhere in policing everywhere. You can look, there's a ton of examples in
Mhm.
the US, there's examples
Mhm.
in Canada where like you had the whole BLM thing going on and then people just stopped engaging in neighborhoods, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm not going in there. I'm not getting a complaint. I can't even look at whatever group it is because it's just going to result in a complaint and there goes
Mhm.
3 years of your life dealing with that. So was that like a part of your study or have you seen that quite a
Yeah.
bit?
Yeah, people raise that too. They would talk about it more like not kind of like in a wholesale way where they wouldn't like it was more about the proactive engagements, right? So they would be like, well, I'm not
Okay.
gonna like run plates or I'm not going to do like more of those kind of yeah, proactive voluntary types of things where they're like, I like why would I absorb that risk? Right. Um, if I'm not confident that I'll be supported kind of by the organization. There's this
Yes.
concept from I think it's like organizational psychology or something like this, but it's like it's called like a psychological contract. So essentially like employees and their employer have this like psychological contract of like what is agreed upon. Like I will do X, Y, and Z, but my expectation is that like I will be treated this way by my employer, right? And so it was a bit of that. Like they saw this breach of that where they were like, I'm willing to put my body at risk, but the expectation is that the organization will come to bat for me. And they just, a lot of people didn't feel that that was being held.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? That comes a lot out of the training you're giving. And,
Mm,
you teach people the criminal code and your policy procedure. It's
right.
like, you're telling me I can do all these things, but then I go and do them. And now on the back end, it's like, well, did you do it this way that I liked it? It's
Yeah.
like, well, you didn't say that at the time, right? Yeah, you're giving a lot of discretion
Yeah.
out there. So,
Right. And that was like, yeah, people just felt like nervous to use discretion, I think is the kind of deep policing that people would describe. And it was interesting because it wasn't when people would talk about what they were seeing in their peers or among themselves, all of them were saw it as a problem, right? They're like, it's not good. Like this, like, I'm not proud that I don't feel confident to do these types of things, right? But they just felt like it was the more strategic thing to do. And so it was unfortunate because, like, again, it on top of um, what it might have for public safety, or whatever, like the impact on their own kind of like self identity and esteem and all thing about their work and how they can perform it was also impacted, right? Because they thought like they knew that they were doing something that they weren't proud of by doing things like that,
yeah.
which is unfortunate to hear. But yeah,
So that's interesting because you can basically have people either disengage or you were mentioning like they can over engage. So they can just keep submitting more
Mhm.
and more stuff and they're like adamant. Like the more I'm told I'm not supposed to do something or I shouldn't be or
Like I'm gonna
kind of
try. Yeah,
yeah, stay in your lane or whatever it is. It's like, oh, okay,
yeah.
I'm just gonna do twice as much.
There was I should say another thing that I thought was kind of cool too is like some people would say things like, "Well, I just know I'm doing the right thing." And so like that I so in the coping literature, that tends to be kind of like one of the healthier ways to do things is to just kind of like look inward to be like, what are my standards? What are my ethics? Whatever. And like that. And so that some people talked about, right? Especially more senior members. They would say things of like, I know I have lawful placement. I know I have integrity. I don't, if someone challenges me, that's fine. I will like follow what is this. And like, I'm not going to change my behavior because of that. And those folks tended to have, again, more senior members tended to also talk about like having like networks of friends, not just having like a lack of support. It's like they were a bit more equipped to be able to take that kind of approach, versus folks who did the depolicing and who tended to withdraw where they felt it was more hopeless, right? And so there was a bit of this kind of, it didn't seem random to me of like what type of coping strategies people use. Like it really did seem to be associated to like what kind of resources do they have, like cultural and practical, who are their connections, how well do they know the organization, all of those kinds of things, versus just being like, oh, anyone might depolice. Like, no, it tended to be more people who were feeling more helpless
Okay.
that things would change or things like that.
All right.
Mhm.
So maybe we'll kind of end on like a positive note.
Yeah.
How do how do people kind of fix this? What can organizations or bosses or whoever it is, middle management, what can they
Mhm.
do to kind of improve the culture in their organizations? What have you seen?
Yeah. So one of the things I think, because so much of the challenges that people were talking about relate to this concept of like organizational justice or procedural justice, right? It's the same thing that we expect police to do with the public, right? Where when you have interactions, make sure that the actual engagement is positive, not just the outcome. Like you can arrest someone, but be courteous, explain to them what happened, all those types of things. It's the same thing internally. So when we make decisions, when we have processes, ensure that it's transparent, ensure that people feel included, make sure that, again, we're having that like conscious kind of like effort to be fair with how we treat people, which goes a bit away from kind of like, again, like traditional paramilitary kind of like strict chain of command ways of thinking, right? Because we think, well, no, if you give a directive, they should do it. That doesn't seem to work or doesn't seem to kind of satisfy people in the long term. So having more of a focus on procedural justice within the organization itself, I think is really important. And something I think that, organizations probably are trying to do, but just being more deliberate and focusing on that if your concern is the culture of how people act. I think also, again, having a bit of, when we talk about culture, like being kind of aware that all of us contribute to the culture and it's not
Yeah.
just like, because and I don't know if you hear this too, right? But a lot of times people will say like, oh, well, it's just the culture,
Yeah.
like culture eats strategy or like all these types of things where they just dismiss it. No, like culture exists because it's functional, right? And so it can be maladaptive and it can be problematic, but like it exists for a reason. And so kind of understanding that instead of just like dismissing why people behave this or think the way they do,
Yeah.
I think is
It
important.
can be both positive and negative thing, right? Like you can have bad cultures and things where people
Totally.
are supporting bad habits or
Mhm.
just outright criminality, but it
For sure.
also keeps people alive and it teaches us how to interact with our environment and how to interact
Mhm.
with other people both within and outside the organization. So
For sure.
it's it depends how you use it.
Totally.
Like any tool, like if people talk about guns and knives, I'm like, it's just some
Mhm.
inanimate object. How you use it, whether it's a weapon
Right.
or it's offensive or defensive. So yeah, I know.
Exactly.
I think you got a lot of great points there.
Well, I was just going to say, to your point about it being a tool, right? It's like exactly that. Then, so if we, as leaders, or as I shouldn't say as leaders because I'm not a leader, but like for leaders and for people who are trying to make change in organizations or trying to change policing or whatever, I think then really understanding culture in that nuanced way is helpful because then you can use it, right? Like, so again, in a really small way, like my example of using humor or whatever, like by knowing that, you can use that to affect change in a way that it's not manipulative, it's not whatever, but it's relevant to the audience that you're working with.
Hmm.
And so I think that understanding also is helpful, and for leadership or decision makers to start to be more like find things that would be relevant and meaningful to the group of people that you're trying to influence, and then use that to your advantage. Like
Yeah,
it seems like just as opposed to saying like trying to suppress it and ignore it and whatever, right?
yeah, yeah. I think that kind of comes down to like a little bit of like motivation versus manipulation. Like if you're doing good and
Totally.
you're being a good leader, you can motivate people. Otherwise, you're just doing the paramilitary kind of side of things and
Mhm.
then you're trying to manipulate where it's like I'm trying to just
Mhm.
make people do things. So
Right. Right.
um
Yeah.
yeah, we're just at the end of our time. I want to know, is there anything kind of new, any projects on the go with you, anything coming out from your area or you specifically in your studies? So kind of tell people what you're up to, and
Mhm.
also if you have any social media or anything where people can follow your work.
Ooh, I think I have like a X/Twitter account that's really inactive. So
Okay, so
no.
don't find you. So
Yeah.
you're not on. Don't worry about social media. Your work's
Don't worry about
secret.
social media. I think I have
Okay.
like a LinkedIn. I have a LinkedIn
All
for
right.
like work stuff. And then yeah, use that. But otherwise, what are we working on? So at EPS right now, like as we talk about change and all of that, our area is trying to develop or is developing a process and a platform for members across the service to submit ideas and get them kind of actioned and advanced. Because recognizing just that again, like a lot of people have things that they want to either try or that could be solutions to challenges that they experience in all of this, but we just don't necessarily always have clear pathways to get that done, especially if you have, maybe a supervisor who doesn't know how to do it or doesn't support your idea. Sometimes it can be blocked off. And so just creating a process for that. So hopefully in the fall that will launch. We're just doing feedback and working with IT now. Our area we have a number of different like police priorities that we're looking into to try to give again some of that like evidence-based lens to, and just working with other researchers to get studies related to those things. So if there's ever anything from your area, please let us know. We're always open to trying to partner folks with researchers. And then myself, I am like desperately trying to finish my dissertation. So we'll be taking a couple of weeks off here soon to write some more, but that's kind of my main focus.
Awesome. Good stuff. Well, I'll say thanks for coming on the show today. And I'll remind people just to like, comment, share The Quiet Professional. And when we get this episode out, yeah, take a listen and share it, because I think there's a lot of good ideas for how to improve these organizations. And obviously, Kat, you're doing super cool work over there. So we appreciate your end of things.
Thank you so much.